Clear prop.
Star 73 is Yankee number 2 following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, extra in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and Designated Pilot Examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Last week we did an episode where we answered a bunch of questions from the student pilot community that got a lot of good responses from both their social media and our social media. So thanks for letting us know how we're doing. Keep getting good feedback from students in the flight school. And I got to say I'm enjoying it as much today as I was when we first started over a year ago. Today we're recording remotely again. Wally, being an airline captain, has schedules picked up and he's flying all around the world again, and so we are thousands of miles apart, and hopefully we sound like we're in the same room together today. How's the weather where you are, Wally?
It's actually dreary. I'm sitting in downtown San Francisco, and it's low overcast, rainy kind of a day.
IFR to leave today later on probably then. They probably don't see many days like that over there.
No.
So that's a good segue. This episode is all about being ready for takeoff. And Wally will take off and head home later today. And I'm sure he'll go through a lot of steps to get ready for that takeoff, even though he's done it hundreds of times from that same airport and that same runway. And we do the same thing in our home airports. We get ready for takeoff. I think every flight has a takeoff. And I think as student pilots and maybe pilots who haven't flown regularly, or maybe a rusty pilot getting back into the left seat again, there's some things that we can remind you about and help you with that I don't think I learned when I was an early student pilot. And I had some great CFIs that taught me a lot of great things, but I think it's just a knowledge base that we continue to learn more and more about what's going on with the aircraft and the control surfaces and all those things that really make the takeoff a lot easier to do once you get more proficient. And we're going to walk through all of those things. Well, I'm going to talk through a little bit about what I was taught early on and what I remember being taught. And then I'm sure I was taught a lot of other things I forgot. But it really seemed a lot about VX and VY, and they were very confusing to me. I remember I thought of the X being shorter than the Y, so I knew that it was a shorter distance that I was going to go, and that's how I remembered my test questions and my answers to that. But it means a lot more today that I'm going to gain the altitude that is so vitally important. And so those things, every aircraft has a VX and VY, and before we started recording, I told Wally I got the opportunity to fly a Vision Jet, and it was a great experience, but I really was concerned about what's VX and VY. They're not going to be the same as they are for a Cessna or Warrior, and those two things become very, very important as you change aircraft and fly different things. Wally, I'm assuming your big jets have a VX and a VY? Yeah,
they do, and they're different based on weight. So they do change a little bit. And, I'll just throw one little trick out there to the listeners that I learned early on. I think most of us know that VX and VY, one of them is best angle of climb speed, and one of them is best rate of climb speed. And sometimes you try to, you get a little confused as to which is which. If you just, on a piece of paper, if you just draw a Y and you draw an X, the X has more angles in it than the Y does. So if you just think of it that way, VX is best angle, and then the only thing left is best rate. So VY must be best rate.
Good tip. You should never miss that on a test ever again, people. I think the next thing that I remember talking a lot about as it related to takeoff, and let's be clear, everyone cares about learning how to land, so you don't spend a lot of time on the takeoffs until post-solo or right around the solo time where you're learning short take, short field, and soft field, and all these other mechanisms that you put into play for takeoff. But I remember being taught, don't make any big turns below 1,000 feet, right? Think about no more than 30 degrees, land right in front of you. If we have this emergency problem, you want to go straight in front. Of course, they're prepping you for solo. You're getting ready to solo, so you don't want to have an incident and not be able to be safe. So they talk about this, don't make big turns, land straight ahead, which again, I think was all great instruction. And I remember a little bit about crosswind correction, but I don't really remember practicing on a day that had a good 10 or 12 knots. Circumstantial, not wanting to do it with a student pilot. I don't know why we didn't do it, but we just didn't do a lot of it. And today, now that I think about the takeoff roll, or I think about preparing for the takeoff, I'm thinking about wind. I'm looking at the windsock 15 times compared to maybe never when I was a student pilot. There's a lot going on in my head. And so I think there's really 5 stages of the takeoff that I think about now that I don't think I was thinking about early on. And that's preparing for the takeoff, lining up, acceleration, rotation, and really the climb out. Before we jump into each one of those, Wally, what have you seen over your much longer career, both instructing and evaluating, that maybe we should incorporate into some of this ready for takeoff conversation?
Well, first of all, I think when we think of flying and we think of currency and we think of proficiency, I think the first thing that everybody thinks of is landings. On a private pilot check ride, I will, in every one of them, I will ask the applicant about currency and proficiency. And occasionally I'll get someone that will tell me that you're required to have 3 landings within the previous 90 days to be current and in category and class. And that's sort of a correct answer. And I'll say, okay, it's just 3 landings? And then they'll go into, well, I need a flight review and I need this. And my point, what I'm trying to get at is it's 3 takeoffs and landings. Now, everybody kind of makes the assumption, well, you've got to take off to land. But if you could have 2 people in the airplane, I could do all the takeoffs, you could do all the landings, and that really doesn't meet the requirement. So, the poor takeoffs get kind of forgotten, but obviously a takeoff is very important. And I see where this episode should air on October 25th. We're getting to down in Houston, we're getting to the months of the year where the weather is a little bit more challenging to find nice days to fly. If we have unlimited ceiling and visibility, a lot of time we have significant winds. So we don't have the 28, 29 days a month that are great for flying like we do maybe in the fall or the spring time in Houston. So the wind is a factor, and I think a lot of people just walk out and get in the airplane and don't really factor into wind on takeoff. But it is something that we ought to have a game plan for. Know where that wind is. What is the airplane going to want to do? The airplane is going to want to turn into the wind. If we got a right quartering headwind, that airplane is going to want to turn right. And so to counteract it, we're going to have to use something to make the airplane stay straight down the runway.
Yeah, and I don't think I thought about that. And we've all probably seen a pilot or been with a pilot who drifted across the center line, and that's the winds making that plane move. It's going to happen less early on, right? Because nothing is quite as effective at low speeds as the wings become faster and the plane's moving faster. We're going to have some of that. So I think the first part of that is the preparation. So what are the winds? We probably check ATIS when we leave our airport for sure. You can check the winds via an ASOS or an AWOS at whatever airport you're at, hopefully. And that preparation is not just about the winds, right? It's what are we going to do? In my brain, it's what are we going to do when we turn? What altitude am I climbing to? What heading do I want to turn to? I can just be honest and say none of this was in my head when I was a student pilot. I know I was going to turn west, but now I'm thinking 264 instead of just the big W on the compass, right? I think there's a lot more that goes into that preparation now than what was there 5 or 6 years ago when I first started learning how to fly. And so I'm probably preparing my passenger briefing. I'm preparing my own brief, like what am I going to do if there's an emergency? What if I what if my engine gargles on the go? What if I have any sort of a problem on the runway and I still have runway left? These things I'm thinking about in sequential order as I'm thinking through my takeoff preparation. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, none of that really happened until I became a multi-engine pilot. And really the sincerity and the importance of making sure you recognize those things on the go in a twin engine aircraft become much more consequential if you don't think about them in a multi-engine aircraft. And I would encourage anyone to just do one sim lesson in a twin and watch how quick a twin can get sideways on a runway with one engine, and you'll appreciate the thought process that goes into that as a private pilot. So any other items you might think about preparing for, Wally? And this is before we get to the hold short line. I'm working through all these. Obviously, we're thinking about the taxi and the taxi diagram and all that, but when you get up, when you've done your prep, anything else that I might have missed?
No, I think we got it.
So now we're going to line up, and a lot of times I can always, when I got to my instrument training, I can remember my instructor saying over and over and over again, we are looking for a reason not to go. And I think I've said this before, but I think I hear people talking about trying to find a reason to go often. Students, they're excited, they want to fly, they want to go, they're trying to convince their instructors, yeah, we can go today. But I think the best advice is truly to find a reason not to go. So we're watching the instruments. You've lined up now. If you have any concern whatsoever, I would, from an instrument world, I think I learned to hold the brakes and put in power and check the instruments if they're moving in the right directions, letting those brakes off, making sure airspeed's coming alive, or I'm going to abort that takeoff. I assume you do something similar in a big jet, Wally. Do you guys hold the brakes, or do you just always go on the go, meaning a roll, more like a soft field takeoff in a big jet?
Yeah, it's 98% of the time a rolling takeoff. There are some short field situations where we may hold the brakes, like at maybe Orange County, California, where it's a fairly short runway.
So most of them are rolling takeoffs. I think I've experienced some pretty quick rolling takeoffs on Southwest flights down here. I think they have like a rodeo number they have to get to. They seem to taxi so fast off the taxiway and onto the runway. It feels like we're at a 20-degree bank when we're turning. But I think once you line up, I think you're thinking about some other things, and I think if you incorporate the mindset of you're looking for a reason not to go, that'd be great. If the oil pressure's not right, if the oil temperature's not right, if the RPMs aren't where you want them to be, if the airspeed's not coming alive exactly like you expect, you're looking for any reason not to go. And an aborted takeoff like that is such the best decision for any pilot, because you can always taxi back and take off again if you made a mistake.
And let's preface this. We're talking about single engine airplanes, because in the larger multi-engine airplanes, we are definitely go oriented, and past 100 knots in a big airplane, a big jet, there are very few things that are going to make us reject the takeoff. An engine failure, a fire, a wind shear alert, something like that, yeah, we're going to reject the takeoff. But at that point, an oil pressure light or an oil temperature light, we're go-oriented. We're going to go take the airplane in the air and come back and bring it around.
And I may be ignorant, but that technically is what really V1 is, isn't it? It's the speed by which you are not going to abort for those lesser things because you have that other engine. If you have an engine failure, is that about what that thought process is?
V1 is takeoff decision speed. It's the speed at prior to V1. The data shows us that we can bring the airplane to a stop within the confines of the runway. After V1, maybe not. Maybe we can't.
Well, we don't deal with that a lot in these Cessnas. I probably could take off and land 3 times on this one airport without ever leaving the runway, the runway environment, right? But all good things to learn and be thinking about, because, like I said, the multi-days are really where I learned a lot about this preparation and lineup thought process for sure. The next one that we talk through is really the acceleration phase. And maybe I just wasn't a good student, but I don't think I really started putting two and two together about the speed of the aircraft creating more wind on all the surfaces that I'm using to control the aircraft. Maybe in a 2D world, maybe a car where you're on the ground, you're not in a 3D world, that you don't have those same experiences. So at 30 knots, the ailerons are doing more, the rudder's doing more, the elevator's doing more or could do more, but it's still probably not enough to lift the aircraft off the ground if you're in a Cessna 172. So you keep gaining that speed, keep scanning those instruments, keep watching out the windows until you get to your VR rotate speed. And at rotate speed, most these 172s is probably 55 knots. As I've flown with people, Wally, I think they think that's takeoff speed. And I ask questions, and a lot seem to really believe it is takeoff speed, that at 55 knots, I'm supposed to pull back and I'm supposed to come off the runway. And that's a dangerous situation. That's really the power on stall practice that we're doing, right? You leave the ground at 55 knots, you're probably not going fast enough to maintain the lift that you need to stay in the air, and you might bounce again, causing bigger problems. But the rotate is you setting the angle of attack on those wings so that as you continue to gain speed, then you do create more lift. And I think it's easy to see. Go watch a video online of a 777 taking off or a 747 taking off. They rotate. That front nose is off the ground for hundreds of feet as it continues to barrel down the runway, picking up speed, and then ultimately lifting off. While it happens faster in a Cessna, that's really the concept by which we're trying to make happen when we accelerate, is we want to get to rotate speed. We want to set that angle of attack by rotating, and then 5-7 knots later, we're going to have enough airspeed to lift off and then stay in the air. And that's when you're probably going to feel other things happen, where if there is a crosswind, the plane's really going to bite into that wind. The plane's going to shift, crab a little bit into that wind. And you want to stay as coordinated as you can at that point. It all leads to a better, smoother flight for your passengers and a safer, better flight for you as the pilot. Anything to add to acceleration there, Wally? I mean,
I think just the concept that we need to address is the fact that we're talking about air moving over the wing, and the faster we're going, the more air is moving over the wing. So the less or the more effective the flight controls are, whether it be rudder, elevator, or ailerons. So it's very possible that on a crosswind takeoff, that as you start the takeoff roll, maybe you put in, I'm just making up numbers here, maybe you put in 60% aileron. But as you speed up, you are able to take that aileron out, because at 50 knots, that aileron's doing a whole lot more than it's doing at 30 knots, just because there's more air moving over the wing. So, I'll ask people, well, if we're taking off and we've got a 40 degree quartering headwind at 12 knots, how much aileron do we need, or how much rudder do we need? And the answer is whatever it takes. Whatever it takes to keep that airplane on center line. I joke with a lot of the applicants. I will tell them that as a taxpayer, they pay for the entire runway. They can use the whole runway. They don't just have to use the left half of the runway, which we see a lot. So, put that airplane on the center line, hold it on the center line, and whatever it takes, whatever aileron and rudder you need to maintain that is what you need to use.
The effectiveness, I don't think, made a lot of sense to me, and again, until later on in my flying career. And when you learn what VMC is and that you have no rudder control at a certain airspeed, you really start to make sense of what all these controls are able to do with certain amounts of wind going across them. And we talked a little bit about rotation too, right? We set that angle of attack, we take off, we start to climb, and then the next thing we're really thinking about, I'm thinking about, is an airspeed, right? I want to get an airspeed set preferably would like to trim for it as reasonably possible, as fast as possible. Quick reference back to the Vision Jet. There's so much thrust in that small aircraft that I was told that as soon as you pull back on that stick and you take flight, you've got to be thumbing that trim, the electronic trim down, forward, pushing it forward, because it's gonna act. There's so much wind going across those surfaces that the trim's really going to affect the pitch of that aircraft. Likewise, in a Cessna, you can set that trim pretty quick with electronic or the rolling trim tab if you have one, both of them, and can set that airspeed that you want it to be. So VX is, let's call it 75. You can set 75 and comfortably trim that out before you get to 400 feet off the ground and let the plane fly out at that airspeed. All the books say climb VX, and then once you clear that 50-foot obstacle, transition to VY. Recently, I hired a flight instructor who we did a little flying in the simulator, and he said, hey, let's do one more lap in the pattern. I'm going to fill your engine on takeoff. And I've never flown better at VX ever in my life as I did on that sim session where I knew my engine was going to fail. And I can remember Tice, my instructor out there, telling me, you want as much altitude as you can get as much altitude as you can get. And every time I would pitch forward a little bit, because it feels better to climb at 80 than it does at 75, and I would want to see where I was going as a young pilot, he would pull back on that yoke and say, we want altitude. We can't turn and get back if we don't have altitude. And that's just a very true statement. I think the more you fly, the more comfortable you become, the more you realize altitude is your best freaking friend. You don't care what's right in front of you because you're in the air. If you can't see right over the nose, you're going to probably be okay. Climb is the key, and VX is your best friend in these smaller aircraft for sure, because you're going to get to 1,000 feet fairly quick at VX. It might take much longer at VY or faster than VY. You have to see a million different types of climb outs, Wally. Share a story or something that's happened funny or fun that you look back and go, I can't believe a CFI would teach a candidate to do this.
Well, I see so many people that like to climb out at a very, very high airspeed, very low angle of attack, and it just takes forever to get to traffic pattern altitude. And it's like you said. I mean, if I could, a typical private pilot check ride, we go out and we end up out in a practice area doing maneuvers, and we're usually around 3,000 feet or so AGL. But there are occasions where there may be a scattered layer of clouds and we have to get up higher. I've had check rides where we're up at 7,500 feet doing steep turns and stalls. And, at some point we do a simulated engine failure, and just the stress level of the applicant from that's 7,500 feet above the ground versus someone who's 1,500 feet above the ground is just remarkably different, and as it should be. I mean, 7,500 feet above the ground with a loss of an engine, you've probably got 10 to 12 to 15 minutes before we're going to touch down. 1,500 feet, maybe you got 2 to 3 minutes before we're going to touch down. So, altitude is time. Altitude is your friend. Now, the other side of that is, do we want to fly out at extremely low speed? No, I mean, you don't want to be below VX. And as you said, once you're clear of the obstacle, VY. But we want to get the airplane up to altitude in a fairly expeditious manner. And I venture to say that most people probably are not very comfortable climbing out at VX. It just maybe doesn't feel right.
It can be pretty steep. Yeah,
so as you're practicing landings, don't just come in and do 6-8 landings of just normal landings. Try different type landings. Let's say, hey, let me practice my short field technique. Let's try a soft field. at some point, if you are a private pilot, you've met the standard on all these maneuvers, but it's something that I think most of us say, well, that's a check ride thing. I'm never going to have to do a short field landing. Well, the fact is, if you have to do an emergency landing, it's probably going to be a short field landing. There aren't many 7,000-foot paved streets just out there, or smooth fields. It's probably going to be a short field landing if you have to do an emergency landing.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And you never know, if you land, you might land somewhere where the bigger runway is damaged or shortened too. So be ready for those short options as well. And then if you do transition to VY, know what that number is, set it and own it. I think too often I hear stories and I hear things, and I've ridden with people where it's clear that the aircraft is flying the pilot and the pilot is not flying the aircraft. And you all, whether you're a student or you're a commercial pilot, you should all be able to point the plane and make it go where you want it to go, not the other way around, because that's a really big opportunity to get hurt if the aircraft is in control and you're not in control.
I was going to say, I hear that a lot on check rides. I will say to someone, okay, well, what happened on this maneuver? Well, I don't know. The airplane was doing this. The airplane was doing that. I'm not sure what was happening. And I remind them, and I've said this on the show before, this is what my father taught me. When you put that seatbelt on, you're strapping the airplane to your back. You're the one who's in control. Make the airplane do what you want it to do.
Yeah, I can remember one time in the pattern when I was solo. It was somewhat of a windy day. I think I was maybe doing right pattern instead of left pattern, and I just could not get the plane to turn. Now, you become a commercial pilot, you start really understanding more about left turning tendencies and how easy it is to do a left chandelle versus a right chandelle. And you start thinking about that traffic pattern back to those days when you're a private pilot. And I just could not get that plane to turn. And I came back and asked my instructor, I said, it was just really weird. I couldn't get the plane to turn. And he goes, you step on the right rudder and turn right? And I said, well, I did. I thought I did, but I was probably somewhat cautious with my pressing of the rudder and low and in the pattern. And I think he was trying to tell me that it's my job to turn that airplane. I'm not waiting for the airplane to turn. So it's much easier to turn a plane left than it is right, and it'll always be that way in a single engine prop plane in the United States. So you might have to give it a little bit more authority when you want to go right pattern. And I remember thinking the plane was flying me, and how I did not like that feeling of the plane flying me. The last step to all this ready for takeoff stuff really is leveling off. And I think there's a tip that I learned that is going to save you time and money and lots of other things, and that is to pitch, power, and trim. So when you get to the altitude that you want to fly at, also let you own it. You stop it at that altitude, you level off at that altitude and own that altitude. And around here, we have a 2,000-foot Class Bravo shelf above us. Most of us probably level off somewhere between 1,500 and 1,900. And I try and pick something different every time so that I'm not lazy and stuck on the same one with someone else. But if I'm going to climb and level off at 1,700 feet today, I'm going to climb to 17. I'm going to continue to climb until about 1,680. And then I'm going to push that nose forward at 1,700, leaving that full throttle, level off, let the airspeed build, back the throttle off to 2,300 RPMs, whatever I'm choosing to set based on my flight plan. And then I'm going to trim that aircraft for level flight. And you'll find, I hear, I know what I did. I would chase the altitude while trimming and using the power. I was probably never going to fly level. But today, if you pitch for level flight at 1,700, you pull the power and set it to what you want it to be, and then you trim it, you'll find that it's much easier to get that airplane to do what you want it to do.
Yeah, I find a lot of people are flying around with airplanes that are out of trim. On a private pilot check ride, the only time I'm really going to touch the controls is when we do unusual attitudes. And I'll say to the applicant, okay, I'll take the airplane. And as soon as I take the airplane, a lot of times it just it's way out of trim. And probably if that's the case, if we have not at this point done steep turns, when we do steep turns, this person very likely is going to struggle with steep turns because they're not trimming the airplane. And I think that's an acquired skill. I think instructors will say it, trim the airplane, and I'm not sure the students understand what they mean. So I think that's something that CFIs could do a better job explaining to people what trimming the airplane should be all about. It shouldn't be, you should be able to let go of the airplane, and it shouldn't really go anywhere.
Yeah, you said it similarly to an acquired skill, and it truly is something that takes time, but it's something you can practice, and you can ask your instructor to practice. Hey, let's climb 300 feet at a time, and let me retrim it, and have them take it out of trim, get back to your altitude you want to go to, climb up to 3,000 feet, trim it perfectly, tell them to untrim it, go down to 2,700, trim it again. You can learn how to do it. And it's freeing. I can remember when the light bulb clicked and I knew how to trim an aircraft quickly and appropriately. It changed my ability to fly tremendously because I got to focus on other things and not constantly fighting that yoke trying to take me in a different direction.
Yeah, a funny trim story. In my commuter airliner days back in 1986, early 87, I flew for an airline in South Louisiana called Royal Airlines. And the bigger airplane that we flew was a Gulfstream G1, which is basically a corporate airplane that had been converted to a airliner configuration, held 24 passengers, and the big deal for us was we had a flight attendant, and the airplanes, we didn't have autopilots in the airplanes, and we didn't have electric trim, so it was just a manual trim situation. And you could tell if you were flying along in cruise. I mean, you had the airplane trimmed, and obviously you were hand flying it because we didn't have an autopilot. But you could tell when the flight attendant walked to the front, because all of a sudden the nose would start coming down, and you'd have to trim it up. So even a fairly light person walking to the front of this airplane would cause it to be out of trim.
Yeah, I'm a pretty big boy, and I've been known to change the pitch when I've slid my chair forward and backwards a time or two, even in these littler aircraft. It will change. Well, good. Hopefully everybody got a little something out of today's episode. You will always be taking off, as you will always be landing safely, hopefully. As always, stay behind the prop and fly safe.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.